Hi, I'm Fran Halsall of Sheffield Woodland Connections, and that's one of Sheffield's many tree charter branches. And the group exists to encourage people to visit their local woodlands, primarily with the objective of helping people learn more about the ecological and social value of woodland. And the plan has been all along to help deliver in-depth knowledge about ancient woodlands and other wooded landscapes in a fun and engaging way. Ecclesall Woods are located in Sheffield's southwestern corner, and they're actually 3 woodlands rolled into one, separated by roads. Between them they cover 140 hectares, and this makes it the largest semi-natural ancient woodland in South Yorkshire. And we know it's an ancient woodland because we can trace its origins on maps to at least 1600, although there are records from before this time. Throughout the 17th century it was managed as a coppice wood or a spring wood, and then in the 19th century many tree species were introduced into the woodland for their timber value when it was managed as a plantation. Today we benefit from both this very large wooded area with its complex ecology, plus these elements of landscape legacy from the different styles and different periods of management, and it all comes together to make a fantastic outdoor classroom. Okay, so we're now heading into Wood 3, which is the largest of the 3 woodlands that make up Ecclesall Woods. And there's lots of interesting veteran trees in this part of the woodland, so follow me down this path and let's see what we can find. This alder tree is one of the typical wet woodland species found in Ecclesall Woods, and I know I'm looking at an alder tree because, well, 2 reasons. One, we can still see the foliage at this time of year, so alder trees actually keep their leaves for a lot longer than many other trees, broadleaf trees in the UK. So they've got actually a very rounded shape to the leaf, and they have quite a indented margin as well. They're quite pointed, so that's an easy way to identify them. But what makes this tree particularly interesting is partly its location. So I mentioned that alder trees are a wet woodland species, so perhaps you wouldn't be surprised to learn that there's actually a stream just behind this. So you will always find alders where the ground is wetter. They specialise in these wetter soils. So there are actually quite a few of them in Ecclesall Woods, and they're not the most common tree species, so they look a little bit like oak, which they're sometimes mistaken for, which there's an awful lot more of. But if it's growing on a watercourse, chances are that you're looking at an alder perhaps. You might also see later in the year that when the leaves fall off, you'll be able to see the nutlets that they have as well, which makes them quite distinctive. But this particular alder is very exciting because it's actually quite old. So there are lots of veteran trees in Ecclesall Woods, but they're not always the most obvious trees because they are not always massive. Some are, and we'll perhaps meet one of those later. But what actually tells me that this is a veteran is what we've got is 2 stems of this tree. I'll describe this as a twin-stemmed tree. And both of these stems are a decent size. So they've clearly got many decades worth of growth in each of these stems. But what we're actually looking at here is a coppice tree. So this part of the tree here is referred to as a coppice stool. And this is the part of the tree which, when a tree is coppiced, so it's cut back to the ground, and coppicing being done in order to ensure a steady supply of small wood. And alder trees in particular are used for their waterproofing properties, or their waterproof properties, because they are wet woodland species, so they get to survive in very damp environments, which makes their wood very valuable. It was used for all sorts of things, including irrigation pipes by the Romans. And also, interestingly enough, Venice itself is built on alder piles, and that's why Venice hasn't quite sunk yet, even though the sea is rising. So this alder tree has been coppiced many times. It's been allowed to regrow, possibly as a multi-stem tree, but we can't tell that now because it's only got 2 stems. So it's been cut back, regrown, cut back and regrown. And it's done that over several cycles. So this tree is almost impossible to age because we don't know how many cycles, because no records were kept for this particular tree. Now we do know that historically in these woods that oak trees were cut on about a 25-year cycle. So these trees might have been cut on a slightly shorter cycle than that. But in order to get to this great size, it's got to have been cut back many times and allowed to regrow many times. So this is what we're looking for, this very wide base. So when we see a wide base to a tree, we've got every reason to suspect that it might be a veteran. This is an older leaf, and we know that we're looking at an older. It's a very symmetrical type of leaf, very even bilateral symmetry down the middle of the leaf. And it's quite round, isn't it? So there's only ever one leaf that I would expect to find in this woodland that's even remotely this round, and that would be a hazel leaf. But it's clearly a tree and not a large shrub, so that helps us identify this, tell it apart from hazel. The other thing we've got here is what we've got is quite a complicated margin. So it's got teeth and serrations on it, so it's quite a distinctive shape to this margin, almost like little teeth within teeth, if you like. That's the pattern here, so that will help you identify these as opposed to other leaves. Older bark can be mistaken for oak tree bark. If you were to look at them side by side, you probably would see that they are quite different, but they're both in that general brownish grey bark kind of area that a lot of trees tend to occupy. But what tells me that this is an alder rather than looking at an oak tree is the fact that this bark is actually quite braided. So by that I mean it's almost like rope-like. You can see that these different strands of bark are kind of crossing over and meeting in the middle. It's also a slightly sort of raised and flaky scaly bark. Now you've just seen that's just come off. I don't encourage people to do that necessarily. You can see it actually lifts. Now oak does that a bit, but probably not quite to the same extent. This is a little bit more brittle. And the other thing that you might just be able to see is that there's like a pattern within the bark itself, and it's quite detailed when you get your eye in, and oak just has a very different look about it. It just doesn't have this same kind of horizontal little patterning within the bark. And this is essentially what the young tree looked like, with lots of horizontal lines in it, but as it's got older they've become lost in the overall roughening of the bark. So we're looking at a rowan tree here. The other name for this is mountain ash, and the reason it's called this partly gives away its location, because they're often found in quite rocky exposed areas, particularly the further north you go. But the reason they're called ash, or named after ash, is because of the leaf shape. So we've got a compound leaf, all this together, made out of individual leaflets, and it's a completely symmetrical leaf, so that's how we can recognise this apart from other leaves which may not be completely symmetrical. It also has a quite distinctive toothed margin, so this is both a smaller leaflet and it has this interesting margin, unlike the common ash, which doesn't have it has a simple margin without any detail in it. So we can easily recognise it from the leaves, but also the berries. If there were some available, we'd be able to see red berries at this time of year, but they've mostly been eaten now, which is a good sign. But we've also got the bark here. So if I told you this was a very smooth bark tree, you might be thinking, well, this is quite a rough example of a smooth bark tree. But it is a smooth bark tree in the sense that it's actually it's quite flat and grey, so there's not a lot of detail in this tree normally. They've got a slightly horizontal linear pattern within it, but it's not particularly prominent, unlike some other trees. And it has like a slightly satiny sheen to it. So on a sunny day, when the light hits these trees, they do really shine brightly, almost as brightly as silver birch. I think everyone knows silver birch for its white papery bark. Well, this is probably the next brightest tree in the woodland on a sunny day, so that's another reason you can pull them apart from the background. But they are not fantastically common trees. There certainly are a lot of them in this wood because it's a large woodland, but they are secondary to things like birch, because there's a lot of birch and there's not as many of these. And like birch, they like to grow in a bit more light. So this tree is actually kind of hemmed in here, and it suggests that when this tree was younger, this area might have been a little bit lighter. And it's just possible because this tree, I suspect, is actually a veteran, so there's various things that tell me this tree is quite old. So it's been here a long time, and over that time it's just got slightly darker. And as a result, the tree is shot up, and it's actually quite a tall tree. And they're normally what I describe as medium-sized trees, and if they had plenty of space to grow, they'd grow into a lovely sort of slightly conical shape, not too conical, not pointed at the top, but certainly a very even, nice shape, so they make a great garden tree. But this one, because it's been forced to find the light, has gone up very spindly and it's not very wide. And what side branches it did have somewhat fallen off, or indeed in this case been taken off. And this is another sign of age. So we've got bark that's missing here, so we can actually see through to the inner layers of the tree here. So this, it's lost its bark naturally because it's just shed it over time, because this is an elderly tree. And you can see the process quite nicely here. Can you see this vertical line that's running up the tree? So this is the tree splitting. So it's like, you know, if you got too big for your skin, or a snake shedding its skin, it's kind of like that, where it's just effectively it's sloughing off its outer bark now. And it can live like this for a long time yet, so they are trees that last a long time in a quite dilapidated looking state. They are very hardy trees, but eventually, you know, all this will go, and then it's, as it is, it's not looking particularly healthy already. There's a lot of branches missing, there's a lot of foliage missing. I reckon it's going to be here for another few decades yet, unless something really bad happens to it, like a secondary disease comes in. So I've reason to think this is a veteran for all these signs that I've mentioned, but also I've measured this previously, and I know that it's 1.5 metres around the girth, and that makes it quite big for an ash tree, a mountain ash tree, a rowan, because in this part of the wood where it's quite dark, trees don't get that large anyway. So on that basis, it's probably older than it looks, because it's had its growth slightly suppressed by the fact that it's not got the best of growing positions for a rowan tree. And yeah, a tree of this size is indicating that it's, you know, it's been here a very long time, but I wouldn't like to guess exactly how long, because these other factors make it a little bit more complicated to read. So the next time you walk past a tree this size and think nothing of it, you might actually be walking past a really elderly tree. This very large and impressive tree is a sweet chestnut, and it actually measures about 420 centimetres around the girth. So it sounds pretty large, and if you look at it, particularly in relation to me, I'm quite small, this is a big tree, and they are very imposing. They are not native to this woodland, so they've actually been brought here from southern Europe, and so they are characteristically the largest trees in the woodland. But they were only introduced here actually about 190 years ago, and because of that we have a timeline for this. So we know this tree, even though it's really massive, really oughtn't to be any older than 190 years old. So this is why tree size can be a really deceptive way of actually reading tree age, because it really does depend on the species. So sweet chestnuts were actually planted deliberately in order to actually make a viable alternative for oak, because oak's a very useful timber. It's got a high tannin content, which is good for water resistance, and so does this tree, but this tree grows a lot faster. So you could have this tree next to an equivalent size oak, and this tree would be a lot younger, because an oak takes a lot longer to grow to the same size. So that's why they're in these woods, and so they're very distinctive because they have large leaves. So if we look at some of the leaves here, this is one that's just recently fallen down in the wind. So they are very long and quite broad leaves. So typically they can get well over, you know, they're 10 centimetres long, longer sometimes, perhaps even as long as 20 centimetres in certain cases. And also this time of year they start to produce these wonderful chestnuts. So they're easy to tell apart from horse chestnuts, because horse chestnuts are kind of a leathery outside with like little spiky bits on it, and whereas these are almost like little green fluffy hedgehogs but slightly spiky. Not as spiky as a hedgehog, it has to be said, but when you're peeling them they soon get a bit spiky. So in about 3 or 4 weeks time I'm going to be picking these up from the woods, because they should be fully mature by then, but this is just one that's blown down early. So how else do we know we're looking at a chestnut tree? Well, it's all about the bark. The bark is incredibly fibrous, so I can actually see the individual strands within the tree here, and that's why I describe it as fibrous. So there's not many trees that you'll find in this woodland that have this kind of quality to it. And if we look at the pattern overall, so some trees are described as braided, and we had a look at one earlier, but this has a very long rope-like pattern through it. And rope's a good analogy here, so like good old-fashioned rope, which is kind of fraying around the edges, is a good way of thinking about this. It's got lots of different like edges to it, and if we were to look at the pattern overall, it's got what I describe as a twist on it. So it looks for all the world like somebody's taken the top of the tree and just given it a little bit of a rotate, so almost like a corkscrew effect. And that is very distinctive about these trees, and the older they get, the more likely they are to do this. So again, we suspect this tree is less than 200 years old, but look at the size of it. So you'd easily think all day long that this was the veteran tree of the woodland, and actually it's really, in terms of its size and its age, it's nothing, because there is a tree in Italy which is thought to be between 2,000 and 4,000 years old. and it's many, many, many metres around the girth. This hasn't even got started. This absolute monster of an oak tree, I have reason to believe, is actually probably one of the largest and oldest trees in the woodland. So we're looking at another twin stem tree here. So this is a tree that has been coppiced and allowed to regrow as two stems. And this is quite the typical form in Ecclesall woods of trees that have been allowed to grow out. So coppice trees traditionally were managed for very small pieces of wood, but when they were allowed to grow out, they might have been grown out to produce more timber effectively, because although this was originally managed in the early part of this woodland's management life history, it was actually all for coppice wood. Eventually it turned into a timber producing woodland. So this tree kind of marks that transition, if you like. So we've got these large trunks of trees, and each of these trees, two trees together, would be a decent sized mature oak tree. Not the biggest by any means, but they're a good size. They're obviously quite mature. But then we know that this tree must have been cut down many times, because look at the size of this coppice stool. This is huge. This is simply the largest coppice stool in the woodland. I've measured it, and it comes out an impressive 4.9 metres around the circumference, the girth of this tree. But the problem with this is that these figures aren't particularly useful to us when we're dealing with coppice trees, or indeed other types of trees that are being managed, because if they've been cut back and they've no longer got a single stem to the tree, then where do you measure the tree? So for a standard height, when we look at measuring trees, be they young trees or potentially ancient trees, we measure them at a standard height, which is 1.5 metres up, which is around about my eye height, because I'm quite short. So around about that height we should be measuring it out. But as is the way with many coppice trees, there tend to be all sorts of knobbly bobbly bits sticking out at weird angles. There might be suckers coming out the side of the tree. So it's very hard to actually measure where a standard height is on a coppice tree, because it's an unusual shape. And even then it wouldn't actually tell us very much, because this tree we know is being cut back and regrown, cut back and regrown. So that figure only tells us how old it would be if it was a single stem tree. But then it's misleading, because this base gets bigger and bigger and bigger each time it's cut back. So we can't use the same arithmetic, we can't use the same guidelines for ageing veteran trees like this that have been coppiced compared to ones that have remained as a single stem and have never been cut. So we have to do some extrapolation. How old is this tree? Well, I'm going to suggest it's anywhere between 300 and 400 years old. And that's not excessively old for an oak tree, because oak trees can live quite happily to 800, 900, 1,000 years. But it's old for this woodland because there's not many trees that have survived being cut down that are that age, because obviously this was a woodland that was managed for timber and also previously for coppicing, so they were useful trees. So if they got to a great size, they were usually cut down. So the characteristic thing about an oak tree's bark is it's incredibly rough. Now obviously this is a characteristic that develops with age, so you could say the rougher the oak tree, the older it is. That's a good rule, but they do tend to get quite craggy fairly young in their life, bearing in mind how long they live. But when we actually look at the quality of the bark, I would say it's divided into plates, and they're kind of long, thin plates, but they're broadly rectangular in their shape. So if you follow that pattern, you can see it throughout the tree. Lots of horizontal divisions, although they're not exactly even. The other thing I think that these trees resemble is actually elephant skin. Very elephantine effect to them. Some trees end up looking very thick at the base as well, which is even more like an elephant's foot almost. But the other characteristic we can see a lot of here is, of course, lichen. And it depends where you are in the world, of course, and to do with some air pollution levels as well. But having a lot of lichen on a tree, the more lichen there is, obviously the greater the age of the tree, because the lichen takes a long time to develop. There are two native oak tree species in this country, sessile oak and peduncular oak, which is often commonly known as English oak. And the difference between them is really only, you can tell, with the acorns. And what we're looking at here is an example of a sessile oak. So it's to do with the way the acorn cups attach to the stalk. So if this was an English oak or a peduncular oak, each of these cups would have its own stem. But as you can see, these are clustered together on around one single stem. So that leads me to think that this is a sessile oak and not a peduncular oak, but really and truly that's the only way you can tell them apart. This somewhat unusual looking tree is actually a beech tree, and there are many beech trees in this woodland, but this is one of the more unusual looking ones. And I would describe its appearance as somewhat noduly, maybe even muscly. This is not typical for a beech tree, which normally have very straight and simple trunks. They don't have a particularly well-defined bark. They're usually quite smooth, although obviously, like every tree, they get rougher with age. So what is going on with this tree? Well, I've every reason to believe that this is actually a tree that's been pollarded. So the difference between coppicing and pollarding is really a matter of what height the tree is cut at. So if a tree is coppiced at the bottom, a pollarded tree is cut above deer browsing height. So one of the reasons this woodland was managed as a coppice woodland, they would have had lots of fencing around the outside to keep deer out, because there's nothing deer-like more than to eat the shoots of freshly emerging shoots of a tree that's regrown after being coppiced. So to get around that in woodlands that were harder to fence and there was more deer around, these trees were always cut above head height. And I think that's what's happened here because, well, two reasons. One, this is not the normal shape of a coppice stool by any means. This is a rather unusual configuration if it had been a coppice tree. And the other thing is as well, beech doesn't really coppice, and there's no records for coppicing beech in this woodland. Whereas in other parts of the country where beech is a more dominant species, there was plenty of records of them having been pollarded. So we can safely assume that this is a tree that's been pollarded because that's what beech trees, that's how they were managed for reproducing timber, not coppiced. So there aren't that many pollarded trees in this woodland. So if this is indeed an example of one, which I think it is, we're looking at quite a special tree here. And again, we've got this problem. How would we measure this tree to work out how old it is? There's just no way. I mean, look at it. It's very knobbly bobbly. This bit's sticking out a long way, it gives you an unrepresentative figure of how old this tree is. So characteristically, as what's happened here, is because it's been pollarded, the crown's actually a lot lower. So most beech trees of this age and this height, the area where the branches actually move out and start spreading outwards would be way above the top of the height of my head. But here we are, it's roughly at head height. So it's quite exciting because you can actually, it brings it down to a human scale, you can actually really see what's going on with this tree. Other unusual features, if you look at this branch just over on the right hand side, it's actually fused with the rest of the part of the tree. This is an unusual process called inosculation, great name, where the layers of bark on the outside, they rub away, and that allows the tree to bond with other similar branches, or even indeed the trunk next to it, where there's also been a bit of rubbing, so those layers combine together. So it's an unusual feature. So there's a lot of things telling me this tree is of a great age. It's been around a long time, but unfortunately, because of its shape and because of the way it's been managed, there's no way I can accurately measure it. So again, we work on the principle that because we know that beech trees don't actually belong in Ecclesall woods, they don't belong in any woods in northern England and further north than that, because they were actually introduced from the south of England. Unlike sweet chestnuts, which we know were introduced into this wood roughly 190 years ago, it's very likely that there's been beech trees here for longer than that time. It's just that they weren't particularly well documented as to when they were introduced here. So on that basis, it's really difficult to estimate. So it could be that this tree's a very unusual tree that's a couple of hundred years old. It equally well could be 300 years old, and it's not really much to give us any clues to tell that apart. So although this is quite an elderly tree, and so as with all elderly trees, they tend to have, you know, a few battle scars, and they tend to look a little bit rough around the edges, shall we say. This is what I describe as a smooth bark, and this is how we can always tell we're looking at a beech tree, because it's a greyish, and it is a grey bark, it's never a brown bark, it's grey, and it's a brighter, shinier grey when it's young, but as it ages, it somewhat looks like skin that's been stretched out, and you can see this, it's like patterns opening up within the skin of the outer skin of the bark, and just kind of separating them. And that's one of the reasons that partly these folds are developed, so it's like effectively the tree's sort of pulling apart effectively, and then healing itself around these areas that it's being pulled apart. But if anything, there is a slightly horizontal pattern going on in here, but it's quite difficult to read. So you'll have to take my word for it when I say that beech is a smooth bark tree, because it normally looks much smoother than this, but again, age tends to give everything that little bit of a rougher edge. So we are looking at another beech tree here, And again, like the one we were looking at before, it has this rather muscly quality to it with lots of protrusions through the bark, quite a lot of splitting where it's healed again. So it's got quite an unusual shape for a beech tree, because beech trees are essentially quite smooth and characterless trees in some ways. They are very tall and they've got a real presence to them, but they're not known for their exciting bark. So what's going on here? Well, I've reason to believe that this is another tree that's like this because it's been managed probably as a pollard, although it's a little bit harder to read this one. But the fact that it's got its crown's low down where the branches split is actually quite low down, it's only just above head height, gives me a reason to believe that this has been managed, because otherwise this wouldn't happen naturally. And this tree now, in its great age, it's probably, you know, at least a couple of 100 years old, maybe a little bit older, and it's actually decided to just have a bit of a slump over, so it's kind of leaning backwards. So it's quite an unusual feature, because I don't know many beech trees that do this. So it's almost like it started falling over and then it's got to a point where it's restored its equilibrium with the gravity and then just carried on growing upwards like trees do. This pine tree is actually one of the largest pine trees in the woodland, certainly one of the largest I've measured. So this comes in at 2.4 metres around the girth, which doesn't sound particularly large, but then pine trees are known for being particularly tall and narrow trees, so it's all relative to the pattern or the form of the tree essentially. So is this tree elderly? Is it a veteran? Well, it's right on the cusp, I think, because it's at a point where if you look at the charts, it would be considered what's called interesting or notable. So it's just one step down from being a true veteran. And it's probably likely that it's not going to be more than a couple of 100 years old anyway, because although pine trees are native more or less to this part of the world, we're actually really at the southern part of their range in this part of the Pennines. So they're a tree more of the north. In fact, they're very common the further north you go, one of the most common trees. So the fact that it's here, it might mean that it's actually not a native part of this woodland. It might well have been planted here, and in which case it probably ties in with the date of lots of the other timber trees that were imported here or were planted here, and that would be around about 200 years ago. Now interestingly, unlike other conifers, which tend to just go straight up and then put some fairly short side branches out, Scots pines do something slightly different. When they get to a certain age, they start pretending that like they're a broadleaf tree, and they do something quite unusual in the crown. So at the top of the tree, it's much like the tree has actually got its arms facing up, but with the shoulders out, almost like the strongman position, as like it's flexing its muscles. And this is unusual. You won't see this on any of the other conifers in this woodland. We also have larch here and also Douglas fir, neither of which are native. But with the Scots pine, this is one of the few that I've actually seen it happen with it in this particular woodland. So there's a small possibility this tree is more on the elderly side because it has this feature. So if you see a pine tree that has this kind of strongman position, or maybe it's just won a race and it's celebrating, that's a sure sign that you're looking at an interesting tree of a notable age.